Welcome to The Inside. This is the week Hollywood has been planning for more than a year. With the 4th of July holiday weekend, a steady stream of major motion picture films will soon hit cinemas from every major studio, with something for just about everybody in the family. I am Jim Chabot in Los Angeles, and with me is Wim Byens. He serves as CEO of Cinionic, and he joins us live from Brussels, Belgium. Good evening, Wim.
Hey, good morning, Jim. Good to hear you.
Wim, you just returned from Cine Europe, and this is really one of the big kickoffs for the holiday weekend in the U.S. What was the mood in Europe last week?
I think the mood was very good, what I could see, in the sense that every show after COVID, people are very keen on seeing the slate, right? They want to see what titles are coming. They were showing, Mission Impossible. They were showing Indiana Jones. So there were, of course, too many to mention, but there were many people very pleased with what they could see. Now, like everybody, says, right, the summer is coming. It's big season, right? So it needs to be strong, but at least people felt upbeat that the content pipeline looked promising.
Well, we have two fantastic guests with us today to take that conversation forward. In a little bit, we're going to be joined by Phedon Papamichael, who will join us from Athens, Greece. Phedon served as the director of photography for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which opened this weekend. So we're excited to be going behind the scenes on this last chapter of this iconic film franchise. But first, we want to get a sense of how the global box office is faring and how the next few weeks and months could roll out. And for that, we've got a fantastic guest.
Yes.
Nancy Tartaglione is the international box office editor and senior contributor to Deadline, Hollywood's source for breaking news. She covers the worldwide film, television, and media business for Deadline, and she joins us from Spain. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Nancy. Thanks for making the time for us.
Of course.
Overall, tell us, how do you see the summer box office so far? And looking ahead, what do you think are factors which could significantly impact the summer season this year?
Well, I think, summer started out really quite strong. It's been a little bit hit and miss of late with some movies that we expected to do better. I think, as Jim was just saying, there's a lot coming up. There's a lot in the next several weeks that I think we're quite hopeful for. Some markets are underperforming or at least not totally firing. Some markets we're really grateful to have back, showing real improvement overseas. But for the moment, I'm very hopeful that we'll finish the summer in great fashion. But I think we've hit like kind of a funny little lull here.
People were really curious, as we are, about The Flash. It did not perform at all, and Elemental from Pixar had a disappointing launch. What do you think happened there?
We've certainly at Deadline, we've written about this to a great extent. I think The Flash, it's kind of a bummer. You guys maybe were at CinemaCon in Vegas as I was in April. I thought the movie played really well, but you've got a deeper DC Universe character. And then if you can't travel your star, internationally, it's so important. You look at Tom Cruise is a different beast, but you look at what Tom is doing right now. He's been in like 8 cities in the last week and a half. But Warner Bros. Was hamstrung with this star. And it's a bummer because, again, I thought it was a pretty good movie.
Do you think these kinds of disappointments affect strategies going forward overall, or do you think they are pretty much title specific?
It's a very good question. I imagine so. I imagine that everybody, there's a lot of retaking of stock on a Monday morning. With regard to Elemental, it has really rebounded overseas. It's not totally on fire, not to, forgive the pun, but it had an 18% drop in its second weekend overseas. And then just this past weekend, I think it was 7%, including China, but only -3%, excluding China. And it's doing really well in Korea. So sometimes you need to give, a little bit of time.
This weekend, Indiana Jones came to the cinema. What are you hearing about the opening weekends? And what's your thought about the Indiana Jones franchise?
I am a diehard Indiana Jones fan. I will start with that. Raiders is right up there in my top 5 movies of all time. But unfortunately, this weekend was a disappointment. It was facing strong headwinds out of Cannes, where it world premiered. I was there, and the reviews were tepid. Audience response has been better, but they're just. I think maybe there's a disconnect, perhaps, with younger audiences. That demo doesn't necessarily race out on opening weekend either, and there's also issues with the franchise, not in and of itself, but simply because it doesn't have a history in some markets. I mean, I said before the weekend, China's usually a swing, but it's not going to do anything in China. And it didn't do anything in China. They don't have a history with that character, with that franchise. Parts of Asia were soft. Latin America was soft. Japan, whose younger audiences have more recently throughout the pandemic sort of turned more towards local fare. You have an older audience there, though, that actually really likes nostalgia. I mean, again, look at what Top Gun had legs for a year in Top Gun Maverick had legs for a year in Japan.
We saw an interesting set of numbers for No Hard Feelings. It's a R-rated comedy starring Jennifer Lawrence. It seemed to impress people that it did better than maybe expected. Is that an indicator that comedies can succeed and do well in this market again? What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, hopefully, I think one of the most challenging areas has been romantic comedies. I mean, this is a hard R, right? This is an R-rated comedy, but we saw audiences return last year to see George Clooney and Julia Roberts in Ticket to Paradise. We've seen some success with R-rated comedies pre-pandemic. I'm speaking internationally. They're not always a sell like The Hangover. It has to be something that's kind of universal. And comedies overseas, at least, typically tend to do well in the more Anglo-Saxon skewing markets, UK, Australia, Germany.
In the next coming weeks, we've got, Mission Impossible, like being said, but followed by Oppenheimer, right, from Christopher Nolan. We've got Barbie from Greta Gerwig. How do you see this impacting the performance of the box office?
Barbie's had like an amazing marketing campaign. I mean, I think the awareness is incredibly high. Also, you've got something that's based on a toy, an iconic doll that really crosses all culture barriers, right? And then you've got Oppenheimer, which, this is my personal opinion, they say don't bet it against Jim Cameron. I think you don't bet against Chris Nolan. This is a different kind of movie. I haven't seen it yet, but everything I've heard, has been very positive. I think that it's important to remember that, isn't this great that we have all these movies coming out after such a fallow period for the last few years, right? It's sometimes unfortunate that there's a head-to-head clash, but I think there's room for all of these movies to succeed.
Let's talk about the different audiences, right? So we talked about Barbie, right? The marketing is definitely catching attention. Christopher Nolan, right, is known for his theatrical spectacle, which he can bring. Definitely a very different audience they're addressing there. So talk us a little bit about the audiences they both attracting, and what is it going to do for the business?
Well, there are different demos there, different audiences, but also no reason that they couldn't cross over. And I think that one of the most important things, again, we heard this at Cine Europe, we hear it at CinemaCon, I hear it from my executives all the time. This diverse offering is so important. There needs to be something out there for everyone. And then it just is really important to have a diversity of films, because also success, or at least traffic, begets more traffic. You get somebody in a movie theater having a good time, they see trailers, they see lobby cards. I mean, that sounds kind of arcane, but it's true.
Movie going is a habit.
Yeah. And you want to continue to reinforce that habit now that a certain part of the world, or many people in the world, had sort of lost it during this period where it was, touch and go, whether we could go outside.
China's been a strong market for Hollywood movies over the last decade. That seems to have cooled a bit due to the pandemic and maybe chillier political relations. Who knows? What's your take on the China market right now?
I don't think we're going to get China back in terms of the way that Hollywood had success, years past, when it was from the years of 2012, when they signed a new agreement, or when the quotas changed and the revenue share changed, through to 2019. It's been better this year in terms of China granting release dates for Hollywood movies, but the audience seems to have just kind of moved on. They're also making their own blockbusters. They've learned that they've excelled in, gotten better in animation. Not all of the patriotic stuff goes down 100%. Just last weekend, not this very past weekend, but like 10 days ago, was Dragon Boat Festival. There were 10 movies released. Really only one is doing well, but it seems like they've started to create their own franchises and their own stars. And that stuff doesn't necessarily travel internationally outside the Chinese diaspora in certain markets, but not that it's over for Hollywood and China, but it doesn't feel like we're going to see those crazy numbers like we had on Avengers Endgame in the summer.
Wim, you have many partners in China. You have a big footprint there with Cineonic and installations in all the major chains and theaters. What are your partners in China telling you? This is really interesting.
No, I think I agree with what's been said here in the sense that it's not going to be easy to get China back. I think the point I do believe we're forgetting is that when we come up with certain content, we're going to have to warm up the audience. We're going to have to bring them back in that mode, or going to make sure there's a connection to that content. And I think that just launching a movie and not being able to do a thorough campaign, which is maybe bigger than it used to be, I think is going to make it tough. So I think my point is Hollywood needs to try harder, but I think also be thoughtful about it, not just because we think it's a good movie in the rest of the world, that it's going to be a good movie in China. So I think we need to target it more. We need to think more and investigate more about what will be subjects which is going to fit better the Chinese audiences.
Nancy, how would you define success for a major theatrical film? Many of them very expensive, the marketing that goes with them. How do you define success? How do you think the studios look at it now? Has it changed over the last couple of years?
It's a really good question. I think that the most important thing that we know for sure is that a theatrical release is the key element because it leads to the downstream revenue. And you simply don't make that kind of money. You don't have that tail. You don't have that life. It's not like the old days where China can save a movie that's not doing well somewhere else, right? Can a movie recoup enough in ancillaries if it didn't do well theatrically? I really leave that up to people with, who have those like special calculators that I don't have.
Looking out for the rest of the year, Nancy, how do you see 2023 for the cinema business?
I think we're in good shape. I mean, we're already up on last year. This isn't going to be the year that, gets us back to a 2019 level. We've got a little bit of a lull in the fall, which I'm sure, you heard the same thing that I did in Barcelona. That's a little bit of a concern, but rest of the summer has some good stuff coming up. Hopefully plugging that hole in the fall is something that's on folks' minds for next year. Overseas in my world that I cover, in depth, there's been some great turnaround for markets like Italy. Spain's doing better, and Italy is a real success story. And also they're investing in this summer. So hopefully that's going to really help.
Nancy, Deadline is among my very first reads early in the morning here. Your analysis and your coverage is always thought-provoking and interesting, and we are so glad you're in the industry. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you guys so much.
We'll be back with a behind-the-scenes look at Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny with cinematographer Phedon Papamichael right after this.
The Insider Show is made possible through the generous support of Cineonic, providing future-ready technical solutions to cinemas. With more than 100,000 projectors installed, Cineonic now illuminates more than half of the world's cinemas every day. Visit cineonic.com.
Our second guest insider today is one of the most revered cinematographers in our industry. Phedon Papamichael was born in Athens, Greece. Setting his sights on a career in film, he spent his professional life creating some of the most memorable and emotional images of our time in more than 50 films, including The Monuments Men, The Trial of the Chicago Seven, Walk the Line, 310 to Yuma, The Descendants, Nebraska, and Ford versus Ferrari. His latest work placed him at the side of his frequent collaborator, director James Mangold. Together, they've created one of the most anticipated films of the year, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. He joins us live today from Athens, Greece. Welcome, Phedon Papamichael.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, congratulations on this film. Want to get right to it. The anticipation has been through the roof. Do you remember when you saw your first Indiana Jones film?
I certainly remember seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think it was in a movie theater in Munich, where at the time I was studying, and it certainly was a big part of me loving Hollywood cinema. I mean, in Germany, we grew up watching on television. We had John Ford Westerns. It was kind of limited exposure. We had like 3 channels, but every Saturday night, I would watch Westerns and other Hollywood adventure fare. So this was a very big influence early on in my career. Yeah.
You've worked with James Mangold on this, your 6th film. You've done so many other genres. Is there something different about shooting an Indiana Jones movie than the other films that you've done?
First of all, I mean, doing the final installment of historical franchise like this is a huge venture, privilege. I did ask Janusz Kaminski, my friend who shot Crystal Skull. Coincidentally, he did the last one. I said, "So how is it, doing one of these things?" He goes, "Oh, it's the hardest movie I've ever done." And I can confirm that it's a huge challenge. I mean, technically, we're in multiple countries, a huge crew, lighting, stages, location. The good thing about this movie, I mean, although certainly it has its share of the effects, but you can go to every location that we shot on and stand there and go, well, this is where this is shot, this is where this is shot, whether it's Scotland or we shot Glasgow for New York, we were in Sicily on the beaches, we were in Morocco and Fez for the tuk-tuk sequence, so you can go to all these places. Of course, there's a lot of stage work as well that cuts in and fills in. So that was a huge challenge, incorporating all the coverage at times, the blue screen, and make it work with all the location work that was done, months apart. So that was a huge challenge.
The American Film Institute has named Indiana Jones as the 2nd greatest movie hero of all time, just behind Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird.
Wow.
How did you want to capture Harrison Ford? What was your vision for getting those images? What were you setting out to do when you worked on this?
Well, as you mentioned, I mean, there's these classic indie images. It's the shadows, the harder shadows on the wall. It is the silhouettes with a little highlight on his eyes. And so we were looking for moments, for the opportune moments, to pay tribute to those visual references to indie. And it was fun looking for them. And from my end, it required a different approach, because I always like to apply logic and to the natural light, but this lend itself, and I wanted to stay very much in tone to the indie movies and to Douglas Stockholm, and play with harder light, play more with colors, play with atmospheric smoke, silhouettes, backlights, things that I usually tend to be more subtle with. In this case, I really embraced it, and Jim was also very much encouraging to dip into that visual, into those aesthetics for this film, and continue the legacy and pay tribute to what these other great masters have done with this franchise.
You've worked with James quite a bit. What happens between the two of you that makes things better or different that you've worked so many times together?
I don't think we think of ourselves as action filmmakers. I mean, we have done, Night and Day also, and of course, Ford versus Ferrari in a way is an action picture. I mean, a lot of car work, high-speed car chases, a lot of rigs, in a way similar to this, where you got your main characters moving all the time. I think that's the biggest challenge on indie also. You still have to capture the characters, which is what Mangold and I focus on. Jim is very, very good about creating intimacy with the main characters. And that's what makes indie work. It's catching all, people are on the run, they're on trains, they're on airplanes, they're on boats. But, it's still allowing the audience to connect to the main character, to have an intimacy, having an emotional context to what's happening, and therefore you have to capture these moments where we like to go in close and be physically close with the camera. We don't really typically do multiple camera setups. We like to approach this movie, Indy and Ford versus Ferrari, very much like we would do a more intimate drama. And I think that's why these movies connect with the audience, because Christian Bale in the car, it's spectacular race car footage, but also it's constantly intercutting with moments of what's happening in his head, what's he all the little beats that he's feeling, and same with Indy. I mean, this is about communicating the humor, the interaction between the characters, and all that while we're in a constant high-speed roller coaster. So that's where it gets technically challenging. But the trick to why Jim's movies, Mango's films, really connect and are maybe different than your standard just action fare is that it's always the priority is to understand what the individual character, what our hero is going through emotionally.
Steven Spielberg said that he told Jim Mangold that making an Indiana Jones movie is like making a trailer that just keeps going for 2 hours.
It's kind of true. Yeah. Everyone asks me, can you single out a sequence that stands out? And I go, well, this is a non-stop roller coaster ride. I really, there's not one sequence more challenging than the other. But we love Spielberg. Of course we watch the Raiders and the indie movies, but also just the way he moves the camera, like Catch Me If You Can. I remember calling Jim and going, look how elegant the camera is and the blocking, and he goes, yeah, Steven really likes that one too. And so we have, like I said, we have similar taste. It's not like we're really having to strain ourselves to copy that style. We in a way comes naturally to us because it's the way we like to tell stories anyway.
There's been much discussion recently, Tom Cruise, Christopher Nolan, and even Steven Spielberg about they make movies for cinema. And I wanted to ask you, what does cinema do for your pictures that makes you feel that your work is properly projected?
I must say, I consider myself as part of that group. I exclusively want to shoot for the big screen as long as it exists. To the point where, I'm scrutinizing everything. It has to hold up big. We joke on the set, well, nobody will notice on an iPhone or an iPad or on an airplane, but, we are not lowering our standards, and we want it to hold up to this high standards of having it gigantic in front of you. That goes for the effects and for my lighting and for the lensing. And I still use lenses that are vintage and were used in the 70s and 80s, anamorphic glass that shows subtleties of little fall-offs and vignettes on the edges, and all that kind of probably gets lost in a smaller viewing format. But to me, it's very important that we shoot for an audience to experience it on the big screen. And there's nothing that can duplicate that, the collective experience of watching a movie, especially when it's engaging and the characters are so magnificent and strong and funny, and I don't want to experience it any other way.
One of the encouraging aspects through the pandemic and since that time is that the theater industry has not stopped for a moment upgrading to laser projection. So now if you go into a movie theater almost anywhere, the chances of it being laser is exponentially higher than it was even 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, everyone has to step up the game because the consumers, especially during COVID, they got confined to their homes, so they all upgraded. They all got big OLEDs or projectors at home. They got better sound systems. So it's a moving target. We have to also step up the cinema game and laser projectors. And there's some other projectors now coming out as well that will increase the viewing quality. And but it's not just that. It's just experiencing in a room with an audience, I think, which is the main difference. And it becoming a social event, going out and having popcorn, being with your family and experiencing with hundreds of other people. That you can't replace at home.
I was struck in preparing the questions for our talk today that I've seen every one of your movies, and we have many wonderful guests on this program. but I'm really struck that the kind of movies you make are the ones I love.
Yeah,
right?
and I feel the same way. I mean, I want to work, and people ask me, how did you, I want to work on movies that I would want to go see myself, that I would buy a ticket for. And I really feel I have managed that, whether I got lucky or I somehow instinctively made the right choices and chose the right filmmakers. But I really like most, like I've done over 50 features, and I kind of like all of them, there were a few, maybe one misstep,
Do you step back, or do you, when you're in a moment of reflection, do you have a sense that you're at the peak of your power, or you've hit a level of expertise and experience and insight that delivers for anyone working with you your very best work?
Yes, I feel very fortunate that I'm in a position and I have found collaborators that I enjoy working with. I'm not super eager to run out and explore new directors because I like working with Jim. I like working with Alexander Payne. We've done, it's like I kind of know what we're doing. And I feel fortunate, but that's why I also sometimes like to do smaller movies. And I have worked recently with Christy Hall, first-time director, who wrote the script, and it's like a tier one, $5 million movie, but great script, great material. So it gives me also, making the bigger movies also gives me the liberty sometimes to, make a little bit of financial sacrifice and working on smaller movies. But I feel very fortunate, and I do worry about the next generations. I know there's a generation younger than me with Hoyte and Greg Fraser and Linus, and and then Roman Vasyanov, and they're coming up that they still. But I am worried a little bit about the cinematographers not having that same clout and their respect, and because of the mystique of what we did has sort of been eliminated by everybody being able to watch it on a monitor. And before, I was a guy with a viewing glass and a light meter and talking to the lab and printing dailies, and so a little bit of that's gone away, and that magic that the people I admired and the old timers and the cinematographers in the past had, I think maybe that's trickling away a little bit.
Do you get time off before you start your next project? And what is your next project?
Well, it's going to be with James Mangold, and we're in pre-production on a Bob Dylan movie with Timothée Chalamet, and that starts very soon. Actually, most of the people are already working on it. I'm about to start that next month, so.
And I will want to see that film as well.
I hope so.
Give our best to Mr. Mangold. We are huge fans of his. Thank you so much for doing what you do and making going to the theater a magical experience. We've not seen Indiana Jones. We will, and maybe we'll see you on Oscar night. That's what my hunch is.
All right.
Thank you so much, Phedon.
Great. Thanks,
and enjoy your break in Athens.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Our quote of the day comes from Tom Cruise, whose Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning opens July 12th. Tom says, "This summer is full of amazing movies to see in theaters. Congratulations, Harrison Ford, on 40 years of Indy and one of the most iconic characters in history. I love a double feature, and it doesn't get more explosive or more pink than one with Oppenheimer and Barbie." Thank you, Phedon. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Wim. And thank you all for listening. The Insiders is presented by Cinionic and produced by the Advanced Imaging Society in Hollywood. Our executive producers are Adam Castles in New York and Mike Piltzecker in Los Angeles. Brett Harrison produced today's show, and our technical director is Matthew Bach-Lombardo. This is AIS.